6:30. Dr. Niket, good morning.
Good morning, ma'am.
Again, a bright morning and bright start of our week. So today's speaker is Dr. You can see the Colonel Dr. Niket Jahan. It was a dream that palliative medicine will go to armed force medical colleges, and now there is a team led by Dr. Niket, Dr. Anand, Purnima, and Varsha. All four of them are working hard to develop a dedicated palliative care program in the biggest hospital of armed forces, that is in AFMC Pune. And here Dr. Niket is there to tell you something about what should we do when patient is in the respiratory distress of various origin. Those who are not knowing Dr. Niket is a very senior professor and head of the Department of Anesthesiology and Critical Care, Armed Forces Medical College, Pune. Her academic qualification is MBBS, FAMC from Pune from 1995, and MD and DNB in 2003 and 2004. She also did fellowship in critical care medicine from Manipal Hospital, Bangalore, and she is also one of the participants from CTC4, where we have picked her up and realized that they are the people who can develop palliative medicine in armed forces hospital also. She has received many military awards, which we just hear all the time, but please listen to these awards. Chief of Army Staff Commendation Card in 2006 and 2014. Director General Armed Forces Medical Services Silver Medal in 2007, and General Officer Commanding in Chief Commendation Card in 2017. So Dr. Niket, we are very proud of you, and on personal note, Dr. Niket and Dr. Anand, they are very polite and very humble, absolutely ready to listen and ready to learn new things. And what we have realized that being a senior most person, Dr. Anand is surgical oncologist and Dr. Niket is head of the Department of Anesthesiologists. They have learned, and they used to sit like a student, and they try to learn as many things as possible in a very simple and humble way. So Dr. Niket, everyone is ready and willing to listen you and eagerly waiting for you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your kind words. Ma'am, is my screen visible?
Yes, visible.
Okay. Respected teachers, and good morning, everyone. Today, I'll be talking about respiratory emergencies in palliative care. This is part 2 of the presentation. Part 1 was covered by Dr. Vivek last week, and I'll be covering 3 topics today. So I'm basically from critical care, and critical care and palliative care seem like the polar opposites. But what is common between both? They both care for the sickest patients in the hospital. Critical care believes in extending life. That is the main focus. However, in palliative care, our focus is comfort and quality of life. The primary goal of each is an important secondary goal for the other. And ever since I have got into learning palliative care and practicing palliative care, I'm always trying to balance between these two. And each one is enriching for the other. So management of respiratory emergency situations, we've been doing it all the while. As an intensivist, as an anesthetist, we've been doing it. But when we do it for palliative care, there are certain extra concerns that we look into, which is stage of the disease and prognosis, nature of emergency, general physical condition of the patient, other comorbidities and symptoms, likely effectiveness and toxicity of available treatments, wishes and goals of care of the patient and their caregivers, and definitely the financial concerns of the patient. So today, the topics that I'll be covering are massive pleural effusion, pneumothorax, and acute and subacute airway obstruction. So these things, all these conditions can occur at end of life. However, since palliative care is now involved in looking after these patients right from the beginning, right from the time of diagnosis, a lot of times these patients will come to us when they are still reversible and when definitive treatment should be given for these conditions. So there are several causes of reversible causes of breathlessness, of which these three are the ones. And as in any other case, good history, clinical examination, and targeted investigations have to be done. First, we'll talk about pleural effusion. So it is important to understand the pathophysiology of pleural effusion. Sorry. First, we'll talk about the physiology of the pleural effusion. In a normal person, the pleural fluid is produced by the parietal pleura at the rate of 0.2 ml per kg per hour, which is approximately 10 to 12 ml in a 60 kg person. This amount of fluid is normal, except in left heart failure, where visceral pleura forms the maximum amount of pleural fluid. The entire volume of pleural fluid is turned over every hour. And this amount of fluid that stays in the pleural space is determined by the balance of hydrostatic and oncotic pressure differences present in the systemic as well as the pulmonary circulations. It is reabsorbed by lymphatics in the parietal pleura, and the flow in these lymphatics can increase by 20 times if the production increases. So there is a lot of reserve capacity. In health, there is an equilibrium between these. However, pleural effusion results from a disturbance of this equilibrium, probably because of increased production or decreased resorption or both. So what are the factors that lead to pleural effusion? There is low oncotic pressure, as we see in hypoalbuminemia. There is elevated pulmonary capillary pressure, increased permeability of the membrane, and lymphatic obstruction, as may happen when cancer invades the lymphatics. Pleural effusion could be small, medium, or large. There's no consensus on the definition. However, as a thumb rule, if the pleural effusion on X-ray is occupying 1/3 of the chest, it's called a small effusion. 1/3 to 2/3 of the chest is moderate, and more than 2/3 of hemithorax, if it is filled with fluid, it is called a large effusion. How much fluid can accumulate in one side? It is about 4 to 5 liters, and it can cause severe respiratory distress. So what are the common causes? Many causes. The infective causes are tuberculosis, pneumonia, sarcoidosis. So in systemic diseases can cause pleural effusion. Congestive heart failure is one of the commonest causes. Liver cirrhosis, which can cause hepatic hydrothorax, nephrotic syndrome, connective tissue disorders like SLE, pulmonary embolism, malignancies, mainly the lung, breast cancers and lymphomas, mesotheliomas. Another thing is pleural metastasis. Pleural effusion can also be idiopathic, and there are other causes like pancreatitis, abdominal sepsis, and chylothorax. Why is it important to know this? Because a patient who's got a cancer doesn't mean that his pleural effusion is always because of cancer. It could be because of heart failure, because he's got some comorbid conditions, or we may be going into renal failure and maybe accumulating fluid because of that. So please remember to look into all the causes of pleural effusion, and then the treatment is directed accordingly. So what are the clinical features? There will be pleuritic chest pain. And this is something I learned new, that only parietal pleura has nociceptors. And then a patient will have dyspnea. The severity of dyspnea does not correlate with the size of the effusion. It is more correlated with the rapidity with which the effusion collects. There can be dry cough. There may be diffuse painful sensation of pressure in the chest. And it may just be that the patient says, I can't sleep. So it does affect the quality of sleep. On clinical examination, if there is a massive pleural effusion, small effusions may be asymptomatic, but if there's a massive pleural effusion, the patient may have tachypnea. There may be tracheal deviation to the opposite side. On percussion, you will find a stony dull note on the affected side. And on auscultation, there will be decreased air entry on the affected side, and you may be able to hear a pleural rub. Imaging is the mainstay of diagnosis of pleural effusion, and this includes chest X-ray, ultrasound, chest CT, which should be done with contrast, and PET scan. PET scan will not tell us much about whether the effusion is malignant or benign. It will tell us the staging of the disease. It will help us find the right spot for biopsy, and that's about what PET scan does, but it's not routinely done for diagnosis of pleural effusion. Chest X-ray is the main investigation. It detects and effusion in the presence of more than 200 ml of collection in AP view, more than 50 ml in lateral view, and lateral decubitus view is done to confirm that the fluid is not loculated, that it is freely flowing around the lung. Most cancer patients who present with dyspnea have moderate to large pleural effusion. They constitute about 80% of the total cases. Massive pleural effusion is seen in only 10% of the cases, and 10% are small. You can see on the X-ray that there is this Ellis curve. We call this the Ellis curve because it goes along the chest wall. So it rises along the corners. USG lung is a very good investigation, and with easy availability of ultrasound machines and now all intensive care units and OTs and emergency departments, this is some skill. This is a skill which I think all palliative care residents and doctors should have. It is more sensitive than chest X-ray. It is better than CT in detecting septae. It helps with identification of pleural metastasis and thickness of the pleural lining, assesses lung expansion after an invasive procedure, and it is used for a quick diagnosis of pneumothorax, which I'll be talking about under pneumothorax. And nowadays, all procedures should be done under ultrasound guidance because it markedly reduces the complications. You can actually see where your needle is going if you do it real time, or you can see with an ultrasound and mark where the needle has to be put, where the fluid is maximum. It can also differentiate between effusion and tumor mass. If you look at this X-ray, this is X-ray of one of our patients. You can see he's got a chemo port inserted. And when this patient came to me, he had history of recurrent pleural effusion. And we got an X-ray, he said, I'm having breathing difficulty. We got an X-ray done, and this was the X-ray. So I thought it's an effusion, and maybe if I tap it, he'll be fine. But I just wanted to do, I also knew that this Ewing's sarcoma had invaded the lung. And when I did the ultrasound, there was absolutely no fluid. This is completely the tumor mass. So ultrasound, in X-ray, both tumor mass and pleural effusion will look alike, but on ultrasound, you can differentiate that there is fluid or solid mass, and this will help you not put a needle in a patient who's got a mass and not an effusion. So this is an extremely useful and very easy skill to learn, which you all must imbibe. Don't be scared of handling the ultrasound, please use it. So key things about how to use ultrasound for pleural effusion. Which is very important to understand the probes of ultrasound and which probe to use for what. So there are three basic probes on ultrasound. One is a linear probe, which is 7.5 to 11 megahertz. It's a high frequency probe, and this is good for superficial structures. So this is a probe we use for diagnosing pneumothorax because we just want to look at the pleura. Then the curvilinear probe has a low frequency probe with a frequency of 2.5 to 7.5 megahertz, and it has deeper penetration. It has a large footprint, and it is used for diagnosis of pleural effusions. And we have an echo or phased array probe, which is generally used for echocardiography. However, it is a low frequency probe and it has a small footprint. So it can also be used for diagnosis of pneumothorax as well as for diagnosis of pleural effusion. So this is how, if you put the curvilinear probe on the side of the chest, this is how you will see the black part. The clean black part is the effusion. This is the effusion. This is the collapsed lung, and this is the spleen, and this is the diaphragm. This is the view you will see. This is called the quad sign. Daniel Lichtenstein has done a lot of research on this, and you must read at least one of his review articles to know what are the different signs of lung ultrasound. This is a small video which shows how lung effusion is seen when you use a curvilinear probe. You can see this is the same picture. This is the spleen, this is the diaphragm, and here somewhere is the collapsed lung, and this is the effusion. If you see this is on B mode or 2D mode, and this is how you will see the pleural effusion on a B mode. So the lung is coming and going. So this is how it appears, and this is the pleural effusion. This is called the sinusoidal sign, and this is the quad sign. CT scan helps us to differentiate between benign and malignant pleural effusion. Pointers to malignant disease are pleural thickening and nodular lesions, like you see here. And there is a CT scan scoring system which says the presence of pleural effusion more than 1 centimeter, metastasis in the liver, lung mass or lung nodule more than 1 centimeter, no loculations, pericardial effusion, and a non-enlarged silhouette of the heart indicates more of a malignant etiology. The CT scan score of 7 is said to predict malignancy with 88% sensitivity and 94% specificity. Other investigations for pleural effusion include thoracocentesis, pleural biopsy, which could be done blind or image-guided, video-assisted thoracoscopic surgery, and we can also do biomarkers, which are soluble protein-based, immunocytochemical, and nucleic acid-based molecules, but it has limited utility and more research is required. So this is how we position the patient for a pleural effusion. The point of insertion of the needle should be marked by using ultrasound, and the point of insertion is generally 1 to 2 intercostal spaces below the upper level of pleural fluid in the mid-scapular line, or 5 to 10 centimeter lateral to the spine. This is to avoid injury to major structures, underlying structures. Indications for thoracocentesis, we could do it for diagnostic purposes and for therapeutic purposes to diagnose it, or to diagnose a sympneumonic effusion because these patients might have a pneumonia, or to do a therapeutic tap to relieve the respiratory distress. It should, I'll repeat any number of times that it should be done under USG guidance because it reduces the complication rate. And as far as possible, these things should be done during working hours and not done at night unless they are an emergency. If you have a pleural effusion, patient is okay, you can do it in the morning, not do it in the middle of the night. Patient requires observation for 1 to 4 hours after tapping, where we should watch out for pneumothorax. However, the incidence is much lower if you do it under ultrasound guidance. If the patient develops any new symptoms after tap, please do an X-ray to rule out a pneumothorax. Now, how to send the samples for pleural fluid analysis? The amount of sample we send is 5 ml for microbiological examination, 2 to 5 for biochemical, and about 20 to 40 ml for cytological. If you're looking for malignant cells, sometimes labs ask for 200 ml also. You should call your lab and find out from them how much sample should I send, and they'll tell you exactly how much to send because they centrifuge it so that the yield of the malignant cells is more. Blood culture bottles are used for bacterial culture, but not for Mycobacterium tuberculosis. For pH measurement, pre-heparinized blood gas syringe is used. Normally, we don't do pH measurement, but it is very useful because acidosis in the pleural fluid is a poor prognostic indicator. We can see a macroscopic view of the kind of fluid that comes out. If it is milky, it could be chylothorax or it could be pus. Bloody effusions indicate possible malignancies. And how do you differentiate between chylothorax from empyema? You centrifuge it in empyema, there will be separation of the contents. However, in chylothorax, it will stay milky white throughout. We also need to know whether it is a transudate or an exudate because that points to the etiology of pleural effusion. Glucose and amylase levels are checked. N-terminal pro-BNP B-type natriuretic peptide is done for heart failure. Differential blood count can be done, and tumor markers are plus minus. So how do we differentiate between transudate and exudate? We use the light criteria, which I'll be discussing in the next slide. But in gross appearance, an exudate looks cloudy. It has a specific weight of more than 1.020. The protein content is higher. It's generally around 3 grams per deciliter. And cholesterol in the fluid is high. It's more than 50 milligrams. And on CT, the density will be 4 to 33 Hounsfield unit. This is more for the radiologist. But a cholesterol of 55 milligrams per deciliter and LDH of more than 200 units per ml is highly specific for the presence of an exudate. So light criteria, exudate or transudate is decided by the light criteria. If at least one of these criteria is present, that is the effusion protein or serum protein is more than the ratio of effusion protein to serum protein is more than 0.5, LDH more than 200, and LDH to serum LDH and effusion LDH ratio is more than 0.6, then it is an exudate. It can light criteria can correctly differentiate between the two in 93 to 96% of the cases, and it has a sensitivity of 99.5%, which is very high. However, the confounding factor of light criteria to diagnose between exudate and transudate is the use of diuretics. If you use diuretics, a transudate may look like an exudate. We also look for glucose, amylase, and DLC in the pleural fluid. Pleural fluid glucose concentration of the pleural fluid is same as plasma glucose. It is reduced in empyema, tuberculosis, malignancy, and rheumatoid arthritis. 50% patients with acute pancreatitis have a pleural effusion with an elevated amylase concentration. And in heart failure, as I said, NT-proBNP is increased, and neutrophils are increased in acute infection. Lymphocytes are increased in chronic infections, heart failure, and malignancy. Microbiological examination, only 25% examinations will reveal the cause of the non-purulent or non-purulent effusions. 5% only positive rate is there in tuberculosis, and if you do AFP culture on this, 10 to 20% cases can be diagnosed. On cytology, 50% lung cancers will show malignant cells in the pleural fluid, and about 60% of all cancers show positive cytology. Positive tumor diagnosis is highest for adenocarcinoma and lower for mesothelioma, squamous cell carcinoma, lymphomas, and sarcomas. A 20 to 60 ml sample of the effusion fluid should be sent for cytological examination. And I said, please ask your lab how much they want. Tumor markers, there is right now insufficient evidence to recommend that tumor markers should be performed on them. So these are the relative frequencies of types of primary malignancies causing malignant pleural effusions. As you can see, it is the lung cancer which leads breast cancer and lymphoma. So malignant pleural effusions are seen in about 50% of all cancer patients. Once they have an effusion, the overall survival is about 3 to 12 months. They present with dyspnea, cough, and chest pain, and tumor cells invade the pleural lymphatics, and that is the reason the pleural effusion happens. So if you see, wet pleural carcinosis has a poor prognosis compared to dry pleural carcinosis. And malignant pleural effusion is the first sign of disease in 2/3 cases of lung cancer. That's very high. And it is generally ipsilateral in 90% cases. Only 10% cases of malignant pleural effusion are bilateral. Now, can you, based on the pleural effusion, prognosticate about a person, about lung carcinoma? So there is a Lent score. L stands for LDH, E stands for the ECOG status, N stands for neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, and T is the tumor type. So this is a score which said if the total score is, this is the score on the left side, you can see 0 to 1, the risk is low and the median survival is about 319 days. 2 to 4, it is moderate, the survival is 130 days, and 5 to 7, high risk, 44 days. However, this score came some years ago, and in the recent few years, a lot of new markers, receptors, and new therapies have come. So if you use the Lent score, the criticism says that it gives generally a prognosis which is poorer than actual. So maybe Lent score needs to be redefined. And however, it is widely used, and this is one prognostic tool used for malignant pleural effusions. So how do we treat these effusions? So it depends again on symptoms, the clinical condition of the patient, type of tumor, response to systemic treatment, and re-expansion of the lung after a therapeutic tap. The options include expectant management. If it is small, just wait and watch and keep observing. Do a therapeutic single-time pleural tap, or insert a pleural drain and instill a pleuroditic agent like talc, cliomycin, doxycycline, or you put a tunneled pleural catheter with which the patient can be sent home and they can aspirate the fluid there. You can do a pleurodesis via thoracoscopy, you can do a pleurectomy or decortication. Pleuroperitoneal shunts can be used. Intraperitoneal, this is not probably done in malignancy, but I'm just talking about an effusion where it can be used, but it's rarely done nowadays. We sometimes have to give fibrinolytic therapy to break the adhesions, and septate and anti-tumor therapies have been used, like chemotherapy, targeted therapy, and immunotherapy, and the recombinant monoclonal antibody bevacizumab, which is an anti-VEGF molecule, has been shown to be useful in treatment of malignant pleural effusion. So thoracosynthesis is generally the first procedure in malignant pleural effusion. It differentiates between dyspnea due to malignant pleural effusion or comorbid conditions. This is very important to remember, to differentiate. And recurrence rate after 30 days, if the etiology is malignant, is 98 to 100%. The poor prognostic indicators are leukocytosis, hypoxemia, hypoalbuminemia. If these three things are present, the median survival is only about 42 days compared to 702 days when it's not the case. So how can we do thoracosynthesis? We can just do one-time tap, tunnel catheter, or we can put ICD with a sclerosing agent. What are the agents? We can use talc in the form of slurry or atomizer, but I have not done it myself. It's generally in our setting done by the pulmonologist, mainly done for the COPD patients. But there are other drugs which can be used like bleomycin and minocycline, tetracycline, doxycycline group of drugs, and 10% betadine. This is a published article from Havir Hospital, Jaipur. Dr. Anjum shared this article, and they use 10% betadine, and they have got very good results with this. It is a very painful procedure, and it needs good sedation and analgesia. So you first have to give lignocaine instillation to the patient, dilute lignocaine in normal saline, and the patient has to continuously change his position so that the lignocaine goes all over the place. You also have to give IV sedation. And once you feel the pleura has been anesthetized, then the pleuroditic agent is instilled, and the patient again has to change position repeatedly so that the drug or the pleuroditic agent goes all over the lung and there is good pleurodesis. Antibiotic cover, oral antibiotics are generally required. And maximum removal when we are tapping is about 1.5 liters. If you remove all of it at one time, there may be re-expansion pulmonary edema. So even if you relieve 1 to 1.5 liters and the patient has much more, stop at 1.5, wait for some time, let the lung expand gradually, and repeat the procedure after 24 to 48 hours. Pleurodesis is indicated for patients whose life expectancy is more than 1 month. Repeated pleural punctures are stressful for the patient. They lead to formation of adhesions and loculations. Complete emptying will no longer be possible, and then they require more hospital visits. So repeated punctures are not to be done. We should go for pleurodesis early in these patients. So there's a Cochrane database review for this as to which pleurodesis agent is better, or whether we should do drainage or pleurodesis via chest tube or through indwelling catheter. They say talc powderage or talc slurry are effective for achieving a pleurodesis with lower failure rates than doxycycline or bleomycin. And indwelling pleural catheters is an alternative approach. It gives inferior definitive pleurodesis rates, but it has comparable control of breathlessness. So symptom control is good, and it has lower risk of requiring repeat invasive pleural interventions. So IPC can also be used. Now, once you have this case, you will wonder whether I should drain it or I shouldn't drain it, being a palliative care setting. So it depends mainly on the prognosis. If the patient has a limited life expectancy of weeks to months, then interventional management should be done. It gives both survival and symptom benefit. But however, if it's a terminally ill patient, we go only with medical management like diuretics and, maybe sometimes NIV support. We give drugs, we give morphine and other treatment, which I'll talk in the end of this presentation. It does give survival benefit. So I'll move on to the next topic, and we'll keep questions for the end. So coming to pneumothorax, are there any questions so far? Or I think we will keep the questions for the end. So coming to pneumothorax, there are many causes of pneumothorax, but the ones relevant to palliative care are COPD and asthma, HIV and AIDS with pneumocystic jirovecii pneumonia, bronchogenic carcinoma or metastatic malignancy, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis and interstitial lung disease, and interventional procedures themselves done for, say, pleural or lung biopsy, pleural tap and central line insertions, chemoport insertions. These can cause pneumothorax. So what are the types? They can be primary and secondary spontaneous pneumothoraces, where there is sometimes no underlying cause, or if you investigate, maybe you will find a cause, or there may be some underlying lung disease. And for these spontaneous pneumothoraces, generally the patient population is they are smokers, tall, thin males, probably patients with Marfan syndrome, and pregnant ladies. Then traumatic is another etiology of pneumothorax, common etiology, blunt injury with rib fractures. Old people, they have falls at home, they have fractured ribs, and they have they can have underlying pneumothorax. Penetrating trauma, vertebral fractures, esophageal rupture. Iatrogenic causes are diagnostic and therapeutic procedures, abdominal surgery near the diaphragm, pneumoperitoneum, as is done in surgery, can cause pneumothorax. Tension pneumothorax, all these can turn into tension pneumothorax. And pneumomediastinum is also an entity we should know about. It is associated with pneumothorax. So on clinical examination, you'll find decreased chest movements on the affected side. Affected side may look hyperinflated if it's a tension pneumothorax. Tracheal deviation to the opposite side is a late sign, and JVP may be elevated, but there may be multiple causes of that, but we must look for it if it's a tension pneumothorax. Palpation, you'll find decreased low tactile vocal fremitus. Intercostal spaces may appear, separated little more, they may be increased. Percussion will be hyperresonant or tympanic, and there will, on auscultation, there will be decreased or absent breath sounds on the affected site. This is the chest X-ray of a pneumothorax. So there is loss, as you can see, there is loss of bronchovascular markings. The lung border is seen here. This is the collapsed lung compared to the other one. You can see the collapsed lung with the lung border. The mediastinum is shifted slightly to the left side, and there is tracheal deviation. And if the patient is lying in this X-ray, we can't see it. There is a deep sulcus sign. If the patient is lying, a lot of times we can't see the pneumothorax very clearly, but there will be a deep sulcus sign. The costophrenic angle will be deep, and there is flattening and depression of the diaphragm. If you are suspecting pneumothorax, chest X-ray should be done in expiration. Normally the X-ray person will tell you take a deep breath, but if you're taking an expiration pneumothorax chest X-ray, do it in expiration, you'll get a better film. Pneumomediastinum, don't miss this if you have it along with pneumothorax. This is how it appears. It appears like air under the around the heart shadow. Extremely important not to miss this. These are generally self-limiting and resolve on their own. However, oxygen therapy will speed the removal of air from this area. Again, I'll talk about lung ultrasound for pneumothorax. Here we use the linear probe. So this is how normal lung looks. This is the pleural line, and this is the rib shadow. You can see there's nothing here, but this is the pleural line, and these are the A lines. On M mode, this is what we call the seashore sign, where this is the tissue and this is the lung, which looks like a sponge, which looks like sand on the beach. So this is called a seashore sign. This is the normal lung, and this is the pleural line. So this is M mode and this is B mode, and we use a linear probe to do this. So here we can see, this is the lung slide. I'll show you a video of this. This is the lung slide, and here the lung slide is absent. You can see there is a subtle difference in this, and this is the point called the lung point, where you can see this is the lung border. This is where the pneumothorax is still here, and here the lung is present, so lung slide is present. If you see this in M mode, it is much more clear, and you see something called a barcode sign. You don't see any sand here. This looks like a barcode. So this is the pathognomic of pneumothorax. So again, comparing all three, this is the seashore sign, which is the normal lung. This is the barcode sign, which is the pneumothorax. And here we can see both together. This is the place where normal lung is there. This is the pneumothorax, and this is called the lung point. So this is how pleural slide looks. This is the pleural slide. You can see this is a dancing pleura. It goes like a shiny line, but here the pleura is not moving. So this is the lung point. There is pneumothorax till here, and till here there is a lung. What are the advantages of ultrasound in diagnosis of pneumothorax? It is a rapid bedside investigation. It is non-invasive. There's no radiation exposure. You don't have to shift the patient anywhere. It can be repeated, and it has high sensitivity and specificity for pneumothorax when CT is used as the gold standard. So it is almost as good as CT scan, and it is bedside, and it's very easy to learn, and you don't have to request any radiologist to come and do the ultrasound or X-ray at that time. You should do it yourself. But the disadvantages are that it is operator dependent, but we are the operators, and if we learn, we can do very good USGs for pneumothorax and pleural effusions. It cannot differentiate. This is a good, important disadvantage, that it cannot differentiate between a COPD bleb and a pneumothorax. And after pleurodesis, only barcode sign is seen because the pleura are stuck to each other. There is no pleural slide visible if the patient has undergone pleurodesis prior to us doing this scan. So if you do a CT scan chest, this is the most reliable imaging study for the diagnosis of pneumothorax, but it is not recommended for routine use. It can help us distinguish between a large bulla and a pneumothorax. It can help us diagnosing small pneumothoraces, which generally don't require drainage. And it also indicates underlying emphysema or emphysema-like changes. So these are emphysematous-like changes, and this is a bulla, which on ultrasound or X-ray may look like a pneumothorax. So what is the treatment? There's medical treatment and surgical treatment. If it's a small pneumothorax, we can wait because it gets absorbed on its own. So we can do a simple aspiration in especially primary spontaneous pneumothorax, where 70 to 87% resolution occurs, and you watch the patient for 6 hours. If it has not reaccumulated, the patient can be discharged home. Otherwise, we can do a tube drainage with or without pleurodesis. In surgical treatment, if the medical treatment fails and the lung does not expand after 5 days, we can do a thoracoscopy or VATS, electrocautery, that is pleurodesis, and sclerotherapy can be done. And resection of blebs and pleura can be done. And laser treatment and open thoracotomy are the other treatments for recurrent pneumothoraces. Small, as I said, small asymptomatic pneumothoraces, you can just wait and watch. So if it's just 2 to 3 centimeters from apex to cupola, it's a small pneumothorax, you can wait. Air is absorbed spontaneously at about 1.25% of pneumothorax per day. And oxygen given by cannula speeds up the resolution of pneumothorax by 4 times compared to room air alone. ICD insertion is another skill that everyone must learn. It's not a very difficult procedure. This is something you do one and you can do the next one. And you have a small bore catheter, a 7 or a 14 French pigtail drain. It can be used in most patients. Again, do this procedure under ultrasound guidance, or at least mark the site under ultrasound guidance. And larger chest tubes are indicated for patients where the lungs fail to expand, or the patient is on ventilator, or there is a suspected underlying small bronchopleural fistula, then we use a larger tube. These tubes either have a Heimlich's valve with which the patient can go home, or they can be connected to underwater seal drains. These air leaks resolve within 7 days of treatment in 80% of the cases, with an average hospital stay of 5 days. We'll keep the tube in situ for 24 hours after the air leak has ceased. And once there is no more bubbling, no more air leak, we can remove these chest tubes. Please remember the site of putting the chest tube is extremely important. A lot of us are scared to put chest tube because we feel, oh, I'll injure something. So important thing to remember is when you are inserting the chest tube, the dissection, the sharp dissection is only on the skin and the little subcutaneous tissue. Rest of it is blunt dissection, so you cannot really injure, and you need to go in the triangle of safety. Come what may, stay in the triangle of safety. So what is this triangle of safety? This is the area marked in these pictures. It is bounded by the anterior axillary line, posterior axillary line, and the nipple line. So please don't go below the nipple line. Whenever you're putting a needle or you're doing a procedure, stay above the nipple line. Stay in this area. You will not create complications, and use ultrasound for guidance. You are very safe. And then your confidence in doing these procedures will increase. So remember the triangle of safety. Whenever you have to do a procedure, the first thing that should come to your mind is triangle of safety. Stay above the nipple line, because this is where the 4th or 5th intercostal space is. And if you remember from your Hutchison, the liver dullness is felt in the 5th intercostal space. The entire liver and the entire spleen is lying in the thoracic cage. So it's not that the entire thoracic cage is lung. A lot of times people go very low and they injure the solid organs, and patients have died because of that. So please be very careful. Stay in the triangle of safety. This is the most important carry-on message you should take home today, is the triangle of safety. So what are the steps of intercostal drain? I'll quickly go through it. So explain the procedure to the patient, take an informed consent, your resuscitation equipment for insertion of the ICD, and one assistant should be available. Should clean and drape like any surgical procedure. Give generous local anesthesia. Give 1% lignocaine, about 10 ml. Give it generously because patient cooperation is extremely important. Incise horizontally along the rib. And you incise along the upper border of the rib and not the lower border, because the neurovascular bundle lies on the lower border of the rib. So stay on the upper border of the rib. In the intercostal space, upper border of the lower rib. So then incise horizontally. After that, just dissect with blunt forceps, make a track with your finger, and use, like this is how we make a track. And it's all blunt dissection here. Incision is only superficial, then blunt dissection, then finger dissection. And then using a curved artery forceps, we hold the intercostal tube and then guide it into the pleural space, fix it, and connected to an underwater drain bag. Surgical interventions, as I've already said, is done if leaks persist for more than 7 days, or if there is recurrent pneumothorax, bilateral pneumothorax, bronchopleural fistulas, patient with AIDS, and if the patient has recurrent pneumothorax, but the patient stays far away from the hospital, stays in a remote village, these are the patients who should undergo surgical intervention, where we do VATS, which is less invasive, less painful, shorter stay in hospital, and thoracotomy with fluorodesis. So recurrent pneumothoraces who are poor candidates for surgery can undergo fluorodesis, and talc 5 to 10 grams in 250 ml sterile isotonic sodium chloride solution is used, or it is insufflated through VATS using an atomizer, or it can be done during thoracotomy or through an ICD. If patients are high risk, they are not good candidates for surgery, then the same thing can be inserted through the ICD in a sterile manner. It's a painful procedure, so analgesia sedation is required, and also antibiotics should be given for 3 to 5 days. This lecture is not complete unless we talk about tension pneumothorax. Tension pneumothorax is an emergency. It is a life-threatening emergency. If you don't identify and treat it immediately, the patient may die. And so many patients die of tension pneumothorax. So what should you do? You should do an emergency needle decompression. It is a life-saving procedure. And after that, in the meantime, you prepare your stuff and you do the ICD insertion. But emergency needle decompression is extremely important. The diagnosis of tension pneumothorax is clinical. Do not wait for the chest X-ray to initiate treatment. Do not wait for the chest X-ray. It's a clinical diagnosis. And if you have an ultrasound handy, you can quickly look at the lung and see that there's no pleural slide and go and put a needle again in the triangle of safety. So use a 14 gauge or a 16 gauge cannula. If you don't have 14, the length is about 3.5 inches. In a normal patient, in Indian patients, generally we are able to reach the pleural space and you'll see a gush of air. We cannot rely on science. Just if you feel definitely the patient is in distress, the pleural slide is missing, clinically there is tympanic node, go ahead and put this needle in the triangle of safety again, not in the second intercostal space. A lot of people say second intercostal space. I have actually seen patients die because of this. Please don't put it in the second intercostal space. We end up going too medially and we end up injuring the major vessels, and we are not even able to drain the pneumothorax. Go in the triangle of safety. So this is a patient who underwent needle decompression initially, followed by an ICD. So this is the ICD here, and this is the pre and post X-ray of a tension pneumothorax with tube thoracostomy. So coming to the last topic of today, which is acute and subacute airway obstruction. So we will talk only about the case causes related to palliative care. Of course, there are many infective causes like epiglottitis, croup, and all those things. We'll not talk about those. We'll talk about primary or metastatic tumors in the region of head, neck, lung, and mediastinum. These can cause airway obstruction at the level of larynx, trachea, or bronchi. And the symptoms depend on the level of obstruction and the degree of obstruction. They can present with minimal stridor or with complete airway obstruction. This is much more severe emergency compared to the previous two that we have discussed. The goals of management in upper airway obstruction are rapid diagnosis and prompt management, which is life-saving. Prompt relief of airway obstruction has a low morbidity and mortality if we are able to get the expert help. This requires expert help, should not interfere with future treatment and diagnosis. For terminally ill patients, we should try and minimize hospitalization and try to make sure that whatever decisions we make should be economical. The classification is proximal or large airway obstruction and distal airway obstruction. So proximal airway obstruction is the hypopharynx, larynx, and trachea till the carina. It is subdivided into the upper airway and lower airway at the mid-trachea. So this is the complete upper airway is hypopharynx, larynx, trachea till the carina. It is subdivided into upper airway and lower airway. Up to mid-trachea is upper airway, because this is the area which is above the sternal notch. This is, if there is an obstruction here, it has a different management. If it is below, it has a different management. because if the obstruction is in the proximal upper airway, it can be bypassed with a tracheostomy or a cricothyrotomy. However, if the obstruction is below the sternal notch, which is the lower part of the trachea, tracheostomy will not help, intubation will not help. So the distal airway obstructions are main stem bronchus, lobar bronchi, and beyond. These are rarely life-threatening, but they cause significant morbidity. Sometimes clinical differentiation between upper and lower airway obstruction might not be possible. So the palliative care relevant causes are complications. Upper airway obstruction can happen in tumors of base of tongue, hypopharynx, lung, thyroid, mediastinum, larynx. Trachea is less common. Even Kaposi's sarcoma has been reported to cause airway obstruction, esophageal cancer, and even the stents placed for non-operable esophageal cancer can cause obstruction in the lower part of the trachea, or it can compress one of the bronchi. So benign causes are aspiration of foreign body, tracheal stenosis or stricture, which can follow prolonged intubation or any procedures done earlier, or tracheostomy, prior tracheostomies can cause this. Tracheomalacia, laryngeal edema, and benign tumors of upper airway like papillomas, common in children, fibromas, and hamartomas. So it's not always malignant. There could be benign causes as well. The clinical presentation depends on whether the disease is endoluminal or whether there is external compression or it is mixed, as shown in these pictures. The site, severity, and rate of progression determines how the patient presents. There can be associated conditions in these patients, which is there could be superior vena cava obstruction or compression, and there could be recurrent laryngeal nerve palsy, making one vocal cord non-functional and giving hoarseness of voice. So most of these patients already have a diagnosis of cancer. However, some of these patients can present with airway obstruction at the first time, and these are cases of Hodgkin's lymphoma in children which have been known to present with airway obstruction. So the clinical presentation which is alarming and which should alert you for airway obstruction are tachypnea, respiratory distress, increased work of breathing, stridor, and in cases of severe obstruction, the patient may be restless, agitated, diaphoretic, tachycardic, unable to lie down or talk, maybe using accessory muscles of respiration. They may be cyanotic, and there may be paradoxical breathing, and in the late stage, there can be bradycardia and cardiac arrest. So on auscultation, we might find a silent chest or there may be a wheeze. But when you see these signs, this is airway obstruction, please call for expert help. Call for help urgently. Investigations in these situations, in at least the acute, there is no role for investigations. Chest X-ray gives you minimal information. CT scan is the investigation of choice and gives maximum, but can you really move these patients to CT scan at that point of time? I'm not sure. Maybe some of them, but not most of them cannot be. CT scan with 3D reconstruction is called virtual bronchoscopy. So if the patient gives you time and there is a tumor which is in the airway, which is causing only partial obstruction, and patient can be sent to CT, we can get a complete picture of the tumor, and rigid and flexible bronchoscopy can be done. Rigid bronchoscopy is the mainstay because rigid bronchoscopy allows us to ventilate the patient during procedures, during diagnosis and treatment. If you put a flexible scope, it does not ventilate the patient, and whatever little airways left, flexible bronchoscope blocks that also. So rigid bronchoscopy is done in these patients. ABG and spirometry also have no role in an emergency. Multidisciplinary approach is required. Of course, these situations can be nightmares for anesthesiologists also who are trained in airway management, but still a multidisciplinary management with anesthesiologists, intensivists, pulmonologists, oncologists, oncosurgeon, radiation oncologists, ENT specialists, and thoracic surgeons is required. We should allow the patient to assume a position of comfort. Don't force the patient to lie down. Late jao. No, don't do that. Tell the patient to sit in the position of comfort, because some of them might like to bend forward, some of them might lie prone or lateral. Let them be in a position, because that's when they are able to move maximum amount of air. Give oxygen or an IV support. PEEP has been shown to be helpful in these patients. And attempt intubation, if attempt intubation has to be done under expert guidance. Smaller endotracheal tubes with assistance of with the surgical airway capability present nearby is important. In these patients, we do not give sedatives and we do not give muscle relaxant. We do these awake intubations by just anesthetizing the upper airway, and we maintain spontaneous breathing, because if you give muscle relaxant or sedative and the patient stops breathing, there's no guarantee that you will be able to ventilate this patient, intubate or ventilate. And you can end up with a cannot intubate, cannot ventilate situation. So if the tumors are at the base of tongue, pyriform fossa, nasopharynx, larynx, epiglottis, vocal cord, surgical airway is required in the form of tracheostomy or cricothyrotomy. On the right side, you see the picture. It's a very simple procedure. There's give local anesthesia if possible, do a scalpel incision of the cricothyroid membrane, skin and cricothyroid membrane, put a bougie, Potex, that's a Potex flexible gum elastic bougie. On top of that, you can thread the tube. If you don't have this cricothyrotomy tube or a chota wala tracheostomy tube, then you can put a small endotracheal tube. A size 6 endotracheal tube can also go. Even if you put a 5, it's okay. You'll be able to ventilate the patient. You'll relieve the obstruction in an emergency. Sometimes patients are so uncooperative, they are unable to lie down for a tracheostomy. So in these patients, a strap cricothyrotomy can be life-saving. Helium and oxygen mixture. Heliox is something very interesting. I have not seen it, but I've read about it since I was an anesthesia resident. It avoids intubation and ventilation in these patients. Till radiotherapy, chemotherapy, or steroids can decrease the tumor mass and relieve the airway compression. So maybe 2 to 3 days, you can give helium and oxygen mixture. It has low density and that flow becomes less turbulent. So it decreases the work of breathing for the patient and improves oxygenation. So this is one therapy, if available, can be used, and it will help you in avoiding any intervention in the upper airway. So this is a CT scan cut section of the chest where there is a large mediastinal mass, and you can see the trachea has been chinked. This is the trachea. So these cases are very challenging because tracheostomy and intubation does not help. The compression is much below that. The tumor presses on the airway, great vessels, right ventricular outflow tract, and the heart. And these patients do not lie supine. They'll prefer to lie down prone or lateral. In undiagnosed cases, oncologists and oncosurgeons are very keen to have a tissue sample before the treatment starts. And the treatment is generally steroids and radiotherapy, and chemotherapy can be started later after we have a tissue diagnosis. So definitive treatment, I'll just talk about this so that we are aware of what definitive treatment is done. Are these cases all hopeless, or there is something that can be done? So the definitive treatment includes laser therapy for endoluminal lesions, electrocautery, which is now coming up, and it's called poor man's laser because laser therapy is expensive, external beam radiation and brachytherapy, chemotherapy, airway stents, surgical resection, and as a time gaining measure, if it's a treatable condition, then femorofemoral bypass while the tumor is removed. So just one quick look about what are the interventions for lower airway obstruction is the argon photocoagulation. This is a laser, or Nd:YAG laser, or photodynamic therapy. So this depends on the location of the lesion, and this picture shows us as to what modality is chosen for what. I'll not go into the details, but there are modalities available for treatment. So managing reversible conditions as emergencies applies to palliative care as well. Now palliative care is involved from the beginning, and a lot of these patients will come with these problems, and all these reversible conditions should be addressed with the same urgency as we do them in other patients. However, if the patient is a poor risk case or is a terminally ill patient, then we go for pharmacological and non-pharmacological measures to provide them comfort care. And please remember, whether it is a salvageable patient or it's an end-of-life patient, being breathless is very, very frightening. So reassurance of the patient is extremely important. And even a small relief that the patient gets by the small interventions that we do is very, very helpful. So for the terminally ill patients, morphine is the mainstay for sedation. It should be given in carefully titrated doses, does not cause CO2 retention or significant respiratory depression. Evidence supports its use not only in cancer, but in heart failure, COPD, and pulmonary fibrosis also. So regular low dose extended release morphine, 10 to 20 milligrams, BD can be used. in constant breathlessness. If it is not available, then immediate release morphine can be used, 2.5 mg orally 4 hourly. Subcutaneous route can be used if the patient is unable to swallow. And if the patient is already on morphine for pain, we can increase the dose by 25% so that breathlessness is also taken care of. Other drugs that can be used in these patients are benzodiazepines, dexmedetomidine, furosemide, and oxygen. And the non-pharmacological interventions are a draft of air from fan or open window, appropriate positioning of the patient in bed, upright position, put a couple of pillows under the patient, let them lie on the side that they feel better in. They can be made to sit on a chair and take support of a table. This is in hospitals, we have these cardiac tables, helpful in cardiac breathlessness because of cardiac failure. Physiotherapy, where breathing exercises can be taught to the patient, techniques to optimize breathing, chest wall vibration, walking aids, occupational therapy, energy conservation techniques, relaxation techniques like massaging the patient's back during an episode of respiratory panic, use of cognitive behavioral therapy to help manage fears and negative thoughts. Acupuncture has been used. However, it all requires multidisciplinary breathless clinics. So from all these three emergencies, the take-home message is that massive pleural effusion, pneumothorax, and acute and subacute airway obstruction in palliative care setting are all emergencies that should be addressed, keeping in mind the symptoms, life expectancy, risk versus benefit of the procedure that is planned, functional status of the patient, and goals of care. Reversible conditions must be addressed aggressively. It requires multidisciplinary management and everyone should be involved. And as in all things palliative care, we should never lose sight of the goals of care, which is comfort, dignity, and quality of life for the patient. With this, I have finished.
Wonderful, Nikhat. It was so practical. It was so practical. And coming from your this thing, I think it was really practical. And I'm expecting that there will be a lot of questions and comments. And Arun, please go ahead with the questions. It was beautiful.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nikhat. So let us try to take the questions. So there is a question and a comment as well. So the question is from Dr. Rajeshri. Thoracocentesis under sonography guidance is definitely possible in secondary and tertiary care institutions, but a lot of palliative care providers are working in the community and they are NGO based. For them, they do not have access to sonography. In such situations, what can we do to provide comfort to patients who need?
Who need pleurocentesis?
Yes, like a pleural tap or pleural drain, something like that.
Correct. And another thing about ultrasound is that it requires the PNDT clearance. So that is one disadvantage in our country, is that ultrasound cannot be used freely. And ultrasounds cannot be taken. If they get a PNDT certificate, they are to be used only in that location. So yes, ultrasound is not available everywhere. But if these patients require, I would suggest this procedure should not be done at home. However, if it is done in a say hospice setting or in a semi-medical kind of setting, chest x-ray should be done just prior to doing the procedure, so that you know exactly where is the effusion and how much is the effusion, because it can keep varying. If it's a large effusion, it's generally safe to drain. But if it's a small effusion and the patient is fine, don't attempt to drain it, because you might create more complications than provide relief. The cause of breathlessness may be something else. If it's a effusion, small effusion, then the cause of breathlessness is not that.
Can I intervene? Can I give my comments? I think the ultrasound has come in last 10 years only, and before that also people were managing it. It's not necessary. It's not Dr. Nikhat is saying that ultrasound is definitely required. But if she's saying that ultrasound should be there as like whenever possible, we should
if it's available,
because it has become a simplest solution for everyone to understand where is fluid, whether it is air, whether it is fluid in the pericardium, and so on and so forth. But definitely blind procedures are possible, and we should not do this at home. Definitely we will not recommend, but in any small peripheral hospitals or PSCs or CSCs, it is possible. That simple x-ray everywhere is possible. Do x-ray and just put a needle and see that if there is a fluid, and just remove that fluid. So because removing fluid definitely will give comfort to the patient. Thank you. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. I think X-ray should be possible. If
X-ray
ultrasound
should
is
be
not
possible, but do it just before. It shouldn't be a week old X-ray. It should be a fresh X-ray.
Yeah.
And of
Yes,
course,
thank you.
clinical examination. Do a percussion and see where the note is stony dull and go 2 spaces below that. And again, if possible, stay in the triangle of safety. If it's a large effusion, stay in the triangle of safety and you're safe. I've stressed that point also, that if you're in the triangle of safety, you are reasonably safe, you will not injure the structures. You can make the patient lie down, the effusion will go backwards, and if you're in the triangle of safety, you will get the pleural fluid out.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. The next question, moving to the next question. Sometimes the effusions in the thorax are not clear. They're viscid effusion. Many times in malignancy, we see viscid effusions. So in those
Exudated.
cases, it will be difficult to get a tab and take the effusion out. What are the possible solutions in those cases?
Again, these have to be done in hospital settings. And if it is not coming out, you use a larger bore chest tube. With a larger bore chest tube also, if it doesn't come, a lot of times fibrinolytic agents are instilled. Otherwise, you have to take expert help and send them to a pulmonologist or to a surgeon.
Okay.
But if you have a large effusion and you think you can do pleurodesis there, it will not work. You have to first remove the effusion. It has to dry out for a couple of days. It's not like I drain the effusion now and I give the drug. No, you have to put the tube, let it drain. And when your output of the drain has reduced significantly, that is the time pleurodesis is done. It may take up to a week. Because the pleura both have to come close and then they have to fuse. If they are away because of the effusion, they will never achieve pleurodesis. You will create more complications. And incomplete pleurodesis is much more harmful than no pleurodesis.
Yes, it may cause, it may turn into the just infective this thing, and it will create empyema. So it is important that we should.
Absolutely.
And I think thick board ICD or thick board, I think pipe is very important in viscid or thick secret to remove secretions.
Okay, we have a few questions. Let us try to take as much we can because the time is short. One question is, how can doctors learn ultrasonography so that they can get experience and the confidence to perform these procedures?
That's a very good question. And I'll tell you, I learned the basics when I first handled ultrasound when I was doing my fellowship in critical care in Manipal Hospital. Till then, I used to think that if I hold the probe of the ultrasound machine, it's going to bite me. So I never touched it. So please, one is first get over your fears. Ultrasound is today the new stethoscope, and every doctor should have it. Every doctor should know how to handle it. And for me, even today, YouTube is a great teacher. So there is lots of things on YouTube which will teach you how to do lung ultrasound. And before that, just read the articles by Dr. Daniel Lichtenstein. There are lots of articles and lots of protocols. I have not mentioned them over here. Read those. And then it is a very simple skill. Ultrasound is very easy. And you need to know something called the knobology. Basically, you should know what settings to use, which probe to use. Now you already know which probe to use. But the various knobs, what are the settings, what is the depth you set? There aren't too many things. Frequency of the probe is more or less fixed. You can change the frequency a little bit and you see what is the depth. So what is the depth? Whatever is the structure you are going to see, you know approximately what is the depth of that structure. So you can measure the depth. And there are just 2-3 knobs that you need to know on ultrasound machine. It's very easy. So the first step is get over your fear of ultrasound. It's a very easy skill to learn. And a lot of times in our ICUs now, we have our own ultrasound. The radiologists don't come. We do our own ultrasounds. So it's becoming like that. Earlier, people used to send the X-ray to the radiologist to report. Today, no radiologist reports on a chest X-ray. We read our own X-rays. And that's how it's becoming with ultrasound, that we do our own ultrasound. And please go on YouTube and you'll find a lot of lovely videos which will teach you how to see pleural effusion, how to see pneumothorax, how to look at pleural thickening, lots of things.
We are out of time, but maybe last one question. Any experience of using diuretics in pleural effusion, like diuretics help in ascites? Taking from that, any experience of using diuretics in pleural effusion?
No personal experience, but diuretics are useful in pleural effusions of heart failure. That is when they reduce. Otherwise, it's not across board that it will help. In malignant pleural effusion, I don't think diuretics will help much. But also it is important to, sorry, Arun, it's always important to remember that pleural effusions also can be multifactorial in some patients. It may not be one cause, it may be multiple causes.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. So, Shannon, there are 2 or 3 more questions.
Yeah, so I think there are 3-4 questions. So what we will do, Nikhat, that we will send these questions, Nisha or Archana will send these questions to you, and we will send a reply definitely.
Yes, ma'am.
Because now it's time and everybody has to go for a job. And it was such a wonderful presentation, Nikhat. And I was just typing this, and now I don't have to type. I just want to say all the people, those who are present, I think many of them have left, that please follow the IAPC website. We are going to organize a very, very basic course on ultrasound, that how one can use ultrasound in various situations. So please follow this website. Initially, we will organize this online, and we will try that all the respective sites, those who will take the lead, we will try to organize these courses and we will teach you in a practical at your own site. So we are working on this, and very soon we will organize a basic course on ultrasound for all the palliative care intervention. Please follow the IAPC website and you will get information very soon. Thank you very much, Nikhat, and
thank you.
It was such a wonderful presentation, and everybody has enjoyed, and all those information which you have told were so practical right from the beginning, from physiology and the basics of all the situations. Thank you very much.